If you're a young Gen Z or millennial watching this, you should already be extremely proud of yourself because you survived the worst pandemic in all of human history and you don't even know it. That's right, COVID. Not the Black Death, but COVID, the very event that altered your life trajectory permanently in 2020, was the worst pandemic in history. And you survived it and lived to tell the tale. You might think this sounds crazy, but trust me, it'll all make sense very soon. Now, I get that on the surface level, this sounds patently absurd. How can you even make such a comparison? The Black Death literally wiped out a third of the entire European population. And well, if you have a very simplistic black and white view of the world with no ability to comprehend nuance, that is true. If you analyze history purely through the singular metric of death count, well then there's really no debate that the Black Death was the single worst pandemic in all of human history. COVID doesn't even come close in terms of that metric. But that's not how historians generally evaluate historical events of crises, and for good reason. There are many other metrics we use, including its effects on the demographics, labor markets, social mobility, generational outcomes, and more. For example, everyone agrees that the Great Depression was bad. This shouldn't be remotely controversial to anyone. But if you only view history through the lens of total death count, the Great Depression would actually be a net positive as life expectancies actually went up during the Great Depression. Now, to this day, nobody knows exactly why this happened, but the most prevalent theory is that people stopped drinking, driving, and smoking so much simply because they didn't have enough money to afford it. The Great Depression probably saved more lives than it killed for this reason. Now, in 1969, a conflict broke out between El Salvador and Honduras known as the Football War. It lasted only 100 hours and resulted in about 2,000 total deaths. The event was quickly forgotten about by the public, and you've likely never heard of it before. If you only care about the metrics of total death counts, the Football War was technically worse than the Great Depression, and yet you'd be absolutely laughed out of any room if you were to seriously propose that. Now, this isn't to say that death isn't tragic. I personally think even one death is really sad, because these aren't just numbers on a screen, these are real people with real families we're talking about here. It just means that it's not the singular end-all be-all metric. We also have to talk about how life was for the survivors, and this is where the comparison becomes very interesting. Part 1. The Black Death versus COVID. So, first of all, before we directly compare the effects of the Black Death versus COVID, let's first establish some general historical context, as this is very important. First of all, generally speaking, across most historical eras, people actually lived quite a bit better than we think because of survivorship bias. Now, this doesn't mean that life was always heaven in the past. It doesn't mean that people didn't face significant hardship and challenges. It just means that generally speaking, in the modern day, we're likely to perceive it as being worse than it really was. Historical evidence is not going to be perfect the way modern scientific evidence is, for the simple fact that we haven't invented a time machine yet. The overwhelming majority of historical records simply haven't stood the test of time. The ones that did, however, are straight up just more likely to talk about the big epic wars, plagues, and famines than just another peaceful day on your farm. A book titled Another Calm Year of Harvest isn't going to sell many copies or be retold in history class 1,000 years later, compared to, say, a historical record detailing all the horrors of the Black Plague or World War II. And nowhere is this historical survivorship bias more apparent than in the Middle Ages. The first thing that always comes to mind when we think of the Middle Ages is, of course, the Black Plague. But if you zoom out, you'll see that the Middle Ages lasted about 1,000 years, and the peak of the Black Plague only lasted about 7. Yet, with the way we talk about the Black Plague in modern political discourse, you'd think that the medieval era was literally a 1,000-year consecutive plague. And that obviously can't be true, because humanity literally would not have survived, and none of us would exist today if that were the case. So, with that in mind, let's for 1 second talk about the Middle Ages with proper historical context. Let's not just talk about the Black Plague itself, but also the time periods before and after to see how life really was. And this is where things get really interesting when you compare it to COVID. Part 3, the worst pandemic in history. 2020 is a year that still lives very viscerally in everyone's head. To this day, we continue to talk about it as the day the world changed forever, and that nothing has quite felt the same ever since. But why? Compared to other pandemics in history, it was relatively mild. We all either got it or knew someone who got it at some point, and most of us survived. Personally, I got it twice. The first time I barely even noticed, and the second time it knocked me out quite bad as I was working out a lot at the time and made the stupid mistake of trying to push through it. The pandemic technically never ended, but for the most part, day-to-day life has resumed. There are no more lockdowns, quarantines, or social distancing measures, and yet the after effects of it for us Gen Z and millennials have been devastating to this day and possibly even forever. I graduated high school in 2008. Perfect timing to enter the job market during the exact time of the 2008 financial crash. Delusional boomers back then gave us the stupid advice of just go to college and don't worry about it. By the time you graduate, the economy will have recovered and everything will be okay. And of course, we all know this never actually happened. The economy itself never really recovered after 2008. But even if it did, my life trajectory, along with that of all my millennial peers, had been permanently altered by that one cataclysmic event. Employers would forever be asking about that gap in my resume, why I had such little work experience, and in a post-2008 economy where even people with master's degrees were applying to work at Starbucks, it was already impossible to get a job in the first place. So this initial small disadvantage turned a gap year into a gap 2 years, a gap 5 years, a gap decade, and now a gap 17 years for me. Now, as bad as we millennials had it, I'd still say that Gen Z had it far worse because COVID was essentially 2008 on steroids. Not only did it have devastating effects on your career trajectory, it was equally devastating in every other aspect of your life as well, socially, mentally, and psychologically. You guys really had it the worst. You missed your most important formative years socially, your early 20s, lost in lockdowns, quarantines, social isolation. You missed your early career milestones, graduation, college, your first entry-level job, etc. You guys missed literally every early adulthood stepping stone through no fault of your own. But here's the best part. You still get blamed for it as if COVID never happened, as if we live in an alternate universe where nothing bad ever happened. Progress happens in steps that build on top of each other. This is something that should be a very basic concept, but your delusional boomer parents can't seem to grasp it at all. You can't run before you even learn to walk. And it's especially true now with how dumb this outdated, stupid job market is. It really feels like an authoritarian dictatorship at this point. I mean, they're so weirdly obsessed with every last thing you did, every goddamn year of your life. Explain this gap in your resume. Explain why you left your last job. Now, in any sane world, this would literally be considered stalking and harassment. But because a corporation and a rich person with a fancy suit and job title does it, that makes it okay, I guess. Hey guys, real quick, we set a goal a while back to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and as you can see, with just a few weeks left, we're actually getting quite close here. So if you're new here and enjoying this content, definitely consider subscribing and helping us get closer to this magic number. Thanks a bunch, you guys are awesome. Now, we've already established that the total death count of the Black Plague was absolutely horrible. No denying this. But we've also established that death count alone cannot be the sole determining factor when evaluating historical crises, and for a good reason. So let's spend some time talking about all the other factors historians use in their evaluations as well. Let's talk about what life was like for young survivors of the plague. Because as you'll soon see, they had it much better than us Gen Z and millennial survivors of COVID, and to be honest, it's not really even all that close. The sharp and sudden population dip that happened after the Black Death had some interesting, unexpected, and shockingly positive benefits to the post-pandemic economy of that era. The lower population created a massive labor shortage, meaning that the young survivors of that era had unprecedented levels of economic prosperity not seen since the Roman Empire. Wages didn't just rise, they took a quantum leap overnight, doubling or even tripling depending on the region. Imagine coming back to work after COVID and seeing that your hourly wage literally tripled just because you survived COVID. Imagine being a typical Starbucks barista, making coffees, and coming back the next day to see that you were actually now making $45 per hour instead of $15. That's literally what happened for young survivors of the Black Death. Now, so far, we've only talked about wages, but that's only half the problem for Gen Z today. The other equally bullshit half of the equation is how ridiculously hard it is to even get a job in the first place. Filling in 700 applications, answering a million bullshit questions about this gap on your resume and where you see yourself in 5 years. Not only do we have to work for dog shit wages, we have to beg to work for dog shit wages. Now, this would have been totally and utterly unheard of in the post-pandemic economy of the Middle Ages. There was such a massive labor shortage that employers were literally begging you to work, and you had serious negotiating power even as a young and inexperienced worker. Compare this to now, where you need 5 years of experience for a dumbass entry-level minimum wage job where you're totally expendable. Let's also talk about property ownership, something that's an unrealistic pipe dream for even the most successful of Gen Z today. This was literally just handed to you in the post-pandemic era of the Middle Ages. A lot of young survivors just straight up unexpectedly inherited plots of land that they could have never dreamed of before. And buying land was never easier, as land was cheap and plentiful. This led to a plethora of secondary benefits beyond the economy as well. Average marriage ages plummeted across England, France, and Spain. Birth rates rebounded, and family life was much more attainable than at any other point in the Middle Ages. They had much higher wages, realistic property ownership odds, higher birth rates, and family formations. All these objective metrics of prosperity that Gen Z got totally screwed over on. And yes, they got all these benefits while working only half the year with over 10 times as many holidays as you have.
How many of you out there have heard that we actually work more than medieval peasants? Because I swear, this infographic, I see this everywhere on Facebook, I see it on Instagram, I see it on TikTok, and just about every kind of article that you can imagine talking about the medieval world and how life wasn't really all that hard for peasants, in comparison to the modern hellhole in which we live. But that number that peasants only worked 150 days out of the entire year is absolute bull. What many people fail to understand is that over time has been a progress of people being able to produce more with less work. Back in the day, it took significantly more time to actually produce things, and so people spent more work outside of regular work making and working on other things.
Okay, let's take some time to beautifully obliterate this dumb corporate shill logic before it totally floods the comment section again. Corporate shills need to sell you this dishonest, revisionist history lie that life was universally horrible before capitalism in order to convince you to continue to be a good little slave to their broken system. And it's very easy to expose the deliberately dishonest and manipulative tactics they're using here. Notice how they dishonestly inflate working hours in pre-capitalist societies by adding unpaid domestic chores to the total calculation, while deliberately and deceptively omitting all the unpaid domestic chores people still have to do today. In fact, if you want to add unpaid domestic chores to the overall total, the picture looks even rosier for a medieval peasant. Most Gen Z and millennials today aren't able to get by in this economy off one job alone. We're likely doing at least one or two side hustles, and that's being generous. There's been plenty of articles detailing how even middle-class jobs like teachers are having to do DoorDash and Uber Eats on the side. This adds up to at least an extra 2 hours of work per day, and that's being very generous. You also have to to factor in the absolute nightmare headache of unpaid commute time every goddamn day in the god-awful traffic just to get to your job. A medieval peasant literally only had to walk 50 steps to get to the farm located on the same plot of land he lived on. It's a well-documented historical fact that medieval peasants got entire winters off, as it was too cold to work on a farm even if they wanted to. Now, corporate shills still count these as work days though, because, well, they had to spend 2 to 3 hours preparing meals for themselves. Now, if this counts as a workday, I literally spend more time walking to the grocery store, waiting in line, buying the food, and preparing it every day. If you want to add unpaid work you do for yourself to the equation, fine. Then you have to add commute times, domestic household chores, food preparations, and all these bullshit extra side hustles people do today just to get by to the calculation for modern Gen Z workers as well. I actually looked up official OECD statistics for all of these, and once you add them to the mix, the average Gen Z today literally works 15 to 17 hours per day, almost every single day of the year by their very own logic. So either way you slice it, we're still literally working 2 or 3 times as much as a medieval peasant, especially compared to one of the post-pandemic era of the Middle Ages. This is the main thing I want to expose about corporate shills, by the way. It's not just that their economic ideas suck, it's that they resort to the most deliberately bad faith, dishonest, and manipulative tactics to try and defend them. And you just saw a perfect example of one right there. Conclusion. You've seen this meme before. Good times create weak men who create hard times, which create strong men, and the cycle repeats itself. Now, ironically, people used this meme in the past to mock Gen Z, but now we're seeing that it's actually Gen Z who are the strong men and women in this cycle. You've survived not just the worst pandemic, but the worst post-pandemic reality in literally all of human history, and I have great faith in you that this strength and resilience will help you change the world massively for the better. And a lot of you are already doing this right now with these massive international Gen Z protests going on right now as we speak. Now, these protests are actually quite a huge deal, and if you're interested in learning more, we made an entire video covering it right here. Check it out. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.